morning, Drew. Oh, it's just me today, Tim? Just you and me? That's right. I've heard you say a lot of things about the iPhone 14 lately. I heard you're not upgrading. Yeah, I'm happy with the 13. And you've said no one should buy the regular iPhone 14. Yeah, it's really not that different, Tim, so. Drew, I'm beginning to think you're not really an Apple sheep anymore. Tim, have you seen the wall we're standing in front of right now? Emphasis on the anymore. You know, you maybe used to like us, but I'm not convinced you do anymore. I'm still very much Team Apple, don't worry, okay? Whenever I do upgrade, it's definitely still gonna be an iPhone. I just don't know if you have proof that you're committed in this relationship. Oh god, we're going there. What do I have to do to prove it to you? In the old days, used to do these videos called Defense RANTs on a lot of our products. Fine, I'll do it. Let's begin. So, I know I've talked a lot of negative pieces around the iPhone 14, but the truth is, I do have a plethora of opinions surrounding the phones, and in my world, Android is not really an option, so it's not like I'm telling people to not buy the iPhone 14 and instead buy some Android. No, I'm usually suggesting another Apple solution that's either cheaper or, in my opinion, better in some way, shape, or form. But that does not mean that I think Apple had a complete botched launch, and if you recall me watching the event, I was still overly happy and excited, but just a lot of edited videos to highlight warnings and things. I try to prevent people from making mistakes or spending more than they need to, but there's definitely a lot of iPhone 14 criticism that I see online that I don't think is completely justified, so that's why I'm defending it in today's video, despite not upgrading to it and not thinking most people should buy it. So the number one criticism I often see of the new iPhones, even from Steve Jobs' daughter herself, is that there's just no innovation, right? Like, Samsung is innovative now, but Apple doesn't innovate anymore. It's just the same old, there's no changes. Have you looked around at the freaking smartphone world? Oh my god, like even Samsung, who can't shut up about their freaking foldables, has basically just iterated and slightly tweaked their foldables for the past 3 years. You can't keep pulling the innovation card for that long, okay? It doesn't work anymore when foldables exist. They've been around for a while, and now new ones are coming out and they just have slightly better displays, slightly better cameras, slightly tweaked CPUs and GPUs. It's the exact same thing as the iPhone. This is what happens when a smartphone market matures and kind of peaks with functionality, and of course, none of these foldables are selling anywhere near as well as the iPhones are, so sometimes it's not just about innovation. That's not the best-selling phone. There are literally billions of phones in the world now, and there's no way you're gonna be able to innovate or come up with something brand new or actually useful to the everyday consumer every single 12 months. Smartphones have existed for a while now, and they're reaching a point of maturity, and that's when you get to the era of refinement and incremental upgrades. Look at the OnePlus phones over the past few years. Look at the Pixel phones over the last few years. You're not getting massive year-over-year upgrades with those either. I think there's a lot of people that are just convinced that iPhones are really the only phones in the world, and because they don't see a big change in the 13 to the 14, they think, oh, Apple sucks now because they just iterate and lightly redesign things. When in reality, that's a smartphone industry trend now, and if you don't like it, you're not gonna find a good solution elsewhere in the tech space. Apple's facing that problem of running out of meaningful changes to make year over year, and so is everybody else. That just happens when a product matures. Number two is that iPhones are too expensive, and of course, this has basically been a criticism of iPhones since they've existed. $500 fully subsidized for an iPhone? Oh, that's ridiculous. Yeah, a lot of people, even on the first generation iPhone, have been convinced that they're too expensive, and then they turn around and end up selling great. And while the prices did not go up in the United States, I'm well aware, yes, I heard you loud and clear, the prices all went up overseas, and there were massive price hikes in England, and in Europe, and in Asia, and in India, of course, and you guys are very frustrated by that, but the truth is, it's not Apple's fault completely. I mean, I'm sure they had likely some influence, but the truth is, a lot of currencies around the globe are tanking in value quickly, and the conversion rate between the US dollar dollar and other countries' currency is getting worse and worse. So when they weaken, Apple has to raise rates in order to combat that weakening currency. On top of that, in the United States, our iPhones are not listed with sales tax, whereas a lot of other countries actually require the price to be listed with the tax, or the VAT, if you will, and that makes it appear that iPhones cost a lot more overseas than they actually do. Even if you account for sales tax, I know they're still more expensive, but import tariffs are also a very real thing outside of the US. Because Apple is an American company and they're bringing a lot of their phones to other countries, that means that they're competing with more domestic products in that area, and because your country around the world may know about how much people are willing to spend on iPhones or consumer goods and electronics and the fees of shipping that in and getting it through customs and everything, they raise rates on import tariffs. So sure, Apple could have just taken the hit on all that and just decided, I guess we're gonna have a less profitable iPhone so that we keep the price the same in that country, but they're a company at the end of the day, and I don't think it's unrealistic to assume that a for-profit company wants to preserve their profit margins. But there is absolutely a lot of foreign pressure on Apple to raise the prices, and that includes the currency's weakening and the import tariffs and the fact that they have to include the price of sales tax for you guys, whereas in the US they do not. So even though the 14 Pro Max is listed as $1,100 in my country, I just got charged for mine recently and it's basically $1,200. But you don't hear people talking about that when they're comparing prices between countries. Number 3 is the no SIM tray thing. The fact that Apple probably got rid of that tray a little bit early, and while yeah, I can understand the frustration, I don't think that's a completely ridiculous complaint. I do have to kind of admit that over time, Apple has accelerated transitions faster than anybody else, whether it's ditching headphone jacks, whether it's ditching physical keyboards, or whether it's ditching FireWire or floppy disk drives. Apple has a common track record of telling people this is the future, this is what we're all moving towards, and everybody getting really annoyed, oh no, I can't believe they do that, and then in the future, it likely will encourage all carriers, not just in the US, but around the world, to get their acts together, make sure that they have a simple and easy to set up way to adopt eSIM, and if we would have kept the SIM tray around, there's a good chance that a lot of carriers would not have tried very hard to improve their eSIM technology and not improve security, of course, because physical SIMs are very easy to remove. If someone just grabs your phone, they can pop it out, whereas an eSIM they can't. And long term, probably not in this generation, but it will likely enable Apple to start designing iPhones differently so that they don't have to accommodate for such a big chunk of the phone. We're not experiencing the benefits of what they could do with maybe a better battery life or better water resistance, because they still have the SIM tray in iPhone 14s outside of the United States. But once they eventually, and I'm sure they will probably next year, ditch the SIM card in all iPhone 15 models, no matter what country you're in, we'll probably reap some of the benefits of that without realizing that the headache was worth it. Another common criticism I've seen, of course, is the use of old chips with the regular 14 and 14 Plus. This is something that from the beginning I've actually not been against, especially when you start hitting a law of diminishing returns with silicon upgrades. People are only doing so much intensive things on their phones at a certain point. Some people do graphic intensive gaming, but it's not everybody, and once Apple started realizing that no one was maxing out the performance of the A15 chip, couple that with the chip shortage, they probably realized, like, why do we need to have such a big emphasis on performance with these smartphone chips when the A15 was already smoking everybody else on the market? There's still no Android with a faster chip in their phone, and no one using their iPhone with these incredibly powerful chips is really being that limited with the raw CPU performance, or really often the GPU performance. Sure, there's edge cases, there's some people that like to edit with LumaFusion on their phone, or there's some people that want to record higher frame rates or something with their phone, but for the most part, I think it's totally fine for Apple to reuse the A15 chip because they know that it's still gonna get the job done, and it allows them to keep their manufacturing costs down and simplify their lineup. Plus, the only devices that are likely gonna take advantage of that higher performing power is the Pros, which did get the new chip, the A16, which on that same subject, I've heard a lot of people complain that the A16 chip is not that much faster than the A15, which I find funny, right? Like, people are mad that the regular 14s didn't get the A16, but simultaneously they're like, yeah, but also the A16 chip isn't that good anyway, so what are you worried about? I think it's perfectly fine that Apple put a bigger emphasis with the A16 chip on efficiency, because that absolutely affects way more people than the raw performance of the chip. How fast it can export a video, how fast it can load applications, or how high a frame rate it can play a mobile game are not going to be as common as the thing in iPhone iPhone usage as how long is the battery life? Is this phone overheating? Will it die before I reach my destination or get through the day, basically? That's absolutely a far more common occurrence, so given smartphone chips are getting probably overkill fast for the phones that are in, I absolutely think Apple made the right call by making it a chip more about efficiency, less so about performance, because this is not a MacBook Pro, okay? We don't need to be too concerned about export tests or Lightroom and focus more on making sure that the phone does not overheat, especially if you're on 5G or you're doing a FaceTime call, and making sure that the battery life can last you throughout the whole day. And it sounds like, even though we've now seen the milliamp hours for the iPhone 14 Pro Max is actually a bit lower than the 13 Pro Max, in battery tests it still seems to be outperforming the 13 Pro Max. Again, it depends on what you're doing. I know there's been cases where the 14 Pro Max doesn't have quite as good as battery life, but it's probably not an apples to apples comparison if it has the always on display. So either way, I don't think that Apple Silicon in phones needs to keep doubling down on faster and faster performance when that's not going to be utilized and it's going to help very few people. Now, another one that we've heard for years of course, is that Android has done this before, especially with the Pro phones. People are like, dynamic island, that's just Apple fancy marketing lingo to cover basically the pill hole, which Samsung had in the Galaxy S10 years ago, so this is not anything new. Okay, first of all, to all of you morons out there, software makes a difference. I don't think you're ever going to understand why people buy iPhones until you can grasp that software integration is key. That's what separates Apple from Android. That's what separates a dynamic island from a pill hole, because there's been pill holes before. Yes, Android phones have had them for years, but they've never really done anything with them. They just kind of pretend they're there and then rely on the third-party community to come up with quirky wallpapers to try to get rid of that little pill hole or camera hole. But Apple actually found a way to integrate this cutout into the software and actually make it a feature. And that fluidity of having different icons and widgets up there and having it dynamically change, that explains the name, makes it incredibly satisfying and functional to use, whereas Android did basically nothing with it. Occasionally, when the camera's activated, they put a little indicator ring around it, but Apple went above and beyond what anybody was expecting them to do with this little camera cutout, to the point that so many people were shocked and surprised because they appreciate software so much. We interact with it just as much as we do hardware, arguably more so. You kind of forget about hardware when software is done so intelligently, and the software support, the longevity of iPhones are the reason so many people don't want to go back to Android. And even if you want to use the argument that like, well, there's still a lot of people on Android, that's the most common platform, iOS market share has been growing in recent history. So your argument that people would rather have, you know, fancier hardware that doesn't last as long and buy a phone where the resale value tanks a lot faster and the software support isn't as good, that doesn't really hold up when, in the grand scheme of the market, there's proof that more people are actually switching away from Android to iOS. I'm aware there's constantly people switching back and forth. Yes, there's some people leaving iOS for Android, but if we're talking about just the grand picture, and I can definitely say from anecdotal evidence that I see it in my comments and live streams all the time, there was a good number of people in our pre-order stream saying that they were pre-ordering the new iPhone from their Galaxy Fold. It's the software they're coming for, and the fact that Dynamic Island takes advantage of something that we've seen in phones before, but takes it to the absolute next level, and it's not some plugin, it's not some skin you have to download, it's not some app you have to sideload. No, that's just baked into the OS, and now it just works to the point where people online now are saying, I don't even really want Apple to get rid of the camera hole anymore because Dynamic Island is so cool, and I'd be worried that they would get rid of it if they made the cameras go completely underneath the display. That's the power of good software integration, because that's something everybody benefits from and interacts with. So yeah, Dynamic Island, I'm gonna say it, it is innovative, it is different, and it lives up to that Apple tagline of think different, and it absolutely proves that they take their time with something in order to get it right, rather than just to get it first. Okay, next big complaint, of course, is that there's no 120 Hz on the regular iPhone 14s. I'm a diehard fan of 120 Hz, and I absolutely want that on as many displays as possible, but as much as I love it, I've tried to show it to many everyday consumers, whether it be my wife or my parents or my friends, and many people outside of the tech community literally do not notice or care. I'm not lying to you. I don't think they're lying either. I show them my phone, I'm like, do you notice the higher refresh rate? And they're just like, not really. No, like, genuinely, a lot of people out there do not give a crap. And Apple probably tests this internally and realize, okay, we could put 120 Hz in these phones, but that's going to drive the cost up. That's going to make manufacturing it harder. And are a lot of people gonna notice or care? No, that's exactly what those phones are for. They're not for the pros. They're not for the techie people. They're for the people that want the latest iPhone and they want some of the latest features, but they just don't want to break the bank. Sure, they may want action mode and they may want satellite texting and that kind of thing, which is what the 14s offer, but not offering a tech specky feature like 120 hertz makes absolutely perfect sense to me. I understand there's cheaper Androids out there that have 120 hertz, but Apple's not going to put money and time towards something that a lot of people aren't going to really notice or appreciate, and I think that's perfectly understandable, despite the fact that I'm a diehard 120 hertz fan. And lastly, because this video is getting too long, a lot of people are complaining that there's no USB-C on the iPhone 14 lineup, and I agree that's absolutely stupid. Sorry, I don't have an excuse for that one. Here's hoping that the EU and Brazil and Indian governments are all able to team up and force Apple to switch to USB-C, and I honestly think there's all kinds of benefits that could come from that Apple would be happy to boast about. You know, there's not too much they can boast about by getting rid of the port, like, hey, guess what? More e-waste now. I guess everybody's gotta buy MagSafe cables, whereas if they switch to USB-C, they can say all your iPad and MacBook chargers will still work with this, and you get faster charging now, you get faster data transfer speeds, all kinds of selling points they could come up with, or Apple Decks. You know, imagine if they just baked Stage Manager into iOS. You could dock your iPhone with an external monitor and have multitasking on the big screen and everything. Like, there's so many selling points you could come up with. So yeah, I want USB-C on the iPhone, and that's a common criticism, and it's justified on that one. I'll give it to you. But let me know if there's any other wild Apple criticisms that you guys hear all the time that bother you, Apple Sheep, down in the comments below. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you in the next one.